She was 74 years old, wearing a coat that had been mended twice, and the only thing she asked for was 5 minutes of someone's time. She never got it. Instead, a grown man grabbed her by the arm in front of a room full of people who had money to spare and none to give. Nobody in that restaurant knew her name. Nobody knew she had buried a husband, raised a son alone, and once slept in a car during a Michigan winter just to keep that son warm. And nobody, not one single person in that room, knew that the boy she raised was now worth more than the restaurant itself, times 1,000, except one waitress. She didn't know that part either. She just knew that an old woman was being humiliated, and she couldn't stand there and watch it happen. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is the story of Emily Carter, a 29-year-old single mother from a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, and Margaret Whitfield, a woman the world had forgotten until the day everything changed. What happened between them didn't just change two lives. It changed the way an entire community looked at kindness, at judgment, and at the quiet dignity of people who have nothing left to prove. Emily Carter had worked at Billioniare's, an upscale restaurant on the east side of town, for almost 3 years. She wasn't the fastest waitress on staff, and she wasn't the one who memorized the wine list to impress regulars. What she had instead was a habit of remembering things that mattered. She remembered that the man in booth 6 always wanted his coffee refilled before he asked. She remembered that the little girl who came in with her grandfather on Sundays liked extra cherries in her water. She remembered because, to Emily, people were not tables. People were people, and she had learned that lesson the hard way. At home, in a 2-bedroom apartment with a radiator that clanked at night, Emily raised her 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, mostly on her own. Sophie's father had left when Sophie was 2, and Emily had never once badmouthed him in front of her daughter, no matter how many nights she cried into a dish towel so Sophie wouldn't hear. Emily's own father, a retired mechanic named Walter, lived in a modest nursing facility 20 minutes away, his memory fading a little more every month. The bills for his care came before rent some months, and rent came before groceries, and Emily had gotten very good at stretching $1 until it nearly tore. That Tuesday morning started like any other. The lunch rush at Billioniare's was already building by 11:45. Men in tailored suits discussing quarterly numbers, women in pearls sipping sparkling water, the kind of crowd that tipped well when they remembered to, and rarely did. Emily had 4 tables and a headache from staying up late helping Sophie with a school project about the water cycle. She was tired in the way that becomes normal when you're a single mother working 2 jobs, tired down in her bones, but she still smiled at every table because that was who she was. At 11:52, the front door opened, and an elderly woman stepped inside. She wore a gray wool coat, the kind you might find at a church rummage sale, buttoned crookedly at the top. Her shoes were sensible, worn thin at the heel. She carried a small brown leather handbag pressed tightly against her side, both hands wrapped around the strap like it held something she couldn't afford to lose. Her white hair was pulled back neatly, and her eyes, though tired, were sharp and alert, scanning the room the way someone does when they are looking for one particular thing. She did not ask for a table. She did not ask for food. She walked up to the host stand and said quietly that she needed to speak with the manager just for a few minutes. The host, a young man named Trevor, looked her up and down and hesitated. Before he could respond, the restaurant manager, a heavy-set man named Roger Daniels, came around the corner and saw her standing there. Something in his face changed immediately, a kind of practiced disgust that comes from years of deciding who belongs somewhere and who doesn't. "Ma'am, this is a private establishment," Daniels said, his voice pitched loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "We don't have anything for you here." The old woman didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for anything," she said. "I only need 5 minutes, please." Daniels didn't wait. He motioned to the security guard stationed near the entrance, a broad-shouldered man named Kevin who mostly spent his shifts checking his phone. Kevin walked over and took the woman's arm, not violently, but firmly enough that she stumbled half a step. A few customers pulled out their phones. One woman near the window laughed under her breath and said something to her lunch companion about people who come in looking for a free meal. The old woman said nothing back. She simply whispered again, "Please, I only need 5 minutes," her voice trembling now, not from fear, but from the particular exhaustion of being unseen. That is when Emily Carter set down the tray she was carrying. Emily walked straight across the dining room, past booth 6, past the window table, and placed herself between Kevin and the old woman. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform for the room. She simply said, clearly enough for Daniels to hear, "You're not touching her." Kevin let go, more out of surprise than obedience. Daniels stepped forward, his face reddening. "Emily, get back to your tables. This isn't your business." "She asked for 5 minutes," Emily said. "You couldn't give her that." The room had gone quiet in the way rooms do when something real happens in the middle of something fake. Daniels, aware now that phones were recording, lowered his voice but not his anger. "You're done here. Turn in your apron." Emily looked at the old woman, whose eyes were wet but steady, and then back at Daniels. She untied her apron without another word and handed it to him. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply walked toward the door, and as she did, she felt a small, weathered hand slip gently around her elbow. It was the old woman, walking out beside her. Have you ever had a moment like that, where doing the right thing cost you something you couldn't afford to lose? Tell us in the comments. We want to know how you would have reacted if you were standing in Emily's shoes that day. Outside, the autumn air was sharp, and Emily stood on the sidewalk holding nothing but her handbag, and the sudden, heavy knowledge that she no longer had a job. Bellamy's paid better than almost anywhere else in town, willing to hire someone with her schedule, someone who needed to leave early twice a week for her father's care appointments. She had fought for that job. She had earned every bit of goodwill it took to keep a schedule that worked around Sophie's school pickups and Walter's doctor visits. Now it was gone in the space of 90 seconds, because she couldn't watch an old woman be humiliated in a room full of people who could afford to be kind and chose not to be. The old woman stood beside her, watching her carefully. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," Emily answered, and she meant it, even as the panic began to rise in her chest. Rent was due in 9 days. Her father's facility had sent a balance notice the week before. Sophie needed new shoes for winter, and Emily had just walked away from the only steady income holding all of it together. She didn't tell the old woman any of this. She simply managed a small, tired smile and said she hoped the woman would find whoever she was looking for. Then she turned to walk toward the bus stop, 3 blocks away, because her car had needed a new transmission she couldn't afford, and the bus had become her daily reality. The old woman did not walk away. She followed quietly a few steps behind. Emily noticed her after the second block and stopped near a small park bench, more out of concern than irritation. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help getting somewhere?" The old woman lowered herself onto the bench, catching her breath. "My name is Margaret," she said. "Margaret Whitfield. Most people call me Maggie." "Emily Carter," Emily said, sitting beside her, glancing at her watch out of habit even though there was, for the first time in 3 years, nowhere she needed to be. Margaret studied her for a long moment. "You lost your job because of me." "I lost my job because a grown man decided grabbing an old woman by the arm was an acceptable way to run a restaurant," Emily said. "That's not on you." Margaret's eyes softened, and for a moment something like recognition passed over her face, quiet and private. "You remind me of someone," she said, almost to herself. "Someone I used to know a long time ago." Emily didn't press her. Instead, she asked the question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the restaurant. "What were you looking for in there? Who did you need to talk to?" Margaret's hands tightened slightly around her handbag. "It's a long story," she said, "and I'm not sure I'm ready to tell it yet." Emily nodded, unbothered. She had learned over years of waiting tables that people share what they're ready to share, and pushing rarely helps. She offered instead to walk Margaret to wherever she needed to go, since it seemed clear the woman had nowhere pressing to be either. As they walked slowly, matching Margaret's pace, Margaret asked Emily questions of her own. Where did she live? Did she have family? Emily answered honestly, without self-pity, the way people do when hardship has simply become the shape of their normal life. She told Margaret about Sophie, about the way her daughter had started drawing pictures of the two of them living in a house with a yard, even though Emily had never promised her one. She told her about her father, Walter, a man who had spent 40 years fixing other people's cars, and now sometimes forgot Emily's name, but never forgot the sound of an engine that needed work. She told her quietly that she had taken a second job 3 nights a week at a 24-hour diner, just to keep the gap between paychecks from swallowing them whole. What Emily didn't mention, because she never thought of it as anything special, was the rest. That she gave half her lunch to a man who slept behind the diner most nights. That she quietly covered the cost of a child's birthday cupcake when a young mother came up short at the register. That she split her tips with a busser who was sending money home to his family in another state. She didn't do these things to be seen. She did them because it never occurred to her not to. Margaret listened to all of it without saying much, but something in her expression had shifted. Something that looked, if you were watching closely, like grief and gratitude tangled together. If you were in Emily's position, working 2 jobs, caring for a parent, raising a child alone, do you think you could have found room in your life for that kind of kindness towards strangers? Let us know what you think. They had walked nearly a mile when Emily first noticed the car. A black sedan, parked across the street, engine idling, 2 men inside who seemed to be watching without watching, the way people do when they don't want to be caught looking. She thought little of it at first. Then she noticed it again 10 minutes later, parked half a block ahead, as if it had circled around. Margaret noticed it too. Her posture changed, her grip on the handbag tightening again, her eyes flicking toward the car in a way quickly practiced. "Do you know them?" Emily asked. "No," Margaret said, too fast, and Emily understood in that moment that Margaret Whitfield was not simply a lost old woman looking for directions. There was something else happening here, something Margaret hadn't told her, and for the first time since leaving the restaurant, Emily felt a small current of unease move through her. Still, she didn't press. She simply steered them both toward a busier street, away from the sedan, and suggested they get Margaret somewhere safe, maybe a cup of coffee somewhere warm while they figured out next steps. Margaret agreed gratefully, and as they walked into a small corner cafe, she said something Emily would remember for a long time afterward. "You didn't ask me why those men might be watching me. Most people would have asked." "You'll tell me if you want to," Emily said simply. "Or you won't. Either way, I'm not leaving you on a sidewalk." Inside the cafe, over 2 cups of coffee Emily paid for with money she genuinely could not spare, Margaret finally set her handbag on the table between them, though she kept one hand resting on top of it. "There are things in here," Margaret said, "that matter more to me than anything else I own, more than money, more some days than my own comfort." Before Emily could respond, a young man near the door, someone who had come in only a minute after they did, moved quickly. He reached across the table, grabbed the handbag, and bolted for the exit before either woman could fully register what was happening. Margaret screamed, a sound sharp and raw, entirely unlike the quiet, composed woman Emily had walked beside for the past hour. "No, please no." Emily was already moving. She had waited tables long enough to know how to move fast through tight spaces, and she caught the young man's jacket just outside the door, pulling hard enough that he stumbled and dropped the bag rather than risk a scene on a crowded sidewalk. He ran. Emily let him go and turned back to Margaret, who was standing in the doorway. Both hands pressed to her mouth, shaking. "It's not about money," Margaret said again, once Emily had placed the bag safely back in her hands. "You don't understand what's inside." "Then show me," Emily said gently, "if you want to." Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the bag on a bench outside the cafe. Inside were a handful of old photographs, edges soft and worn from being handled too many times over too many years. A folded letter, the ink faded to a pale brown. A small diamond necklace wrapped carefully in a handkerchief. And one photograph, older than the rest, of a young boy standing beside a woman who was, unmistakably, a much younger Margaret. Emily looked at the photograph, and something about the boy's face tugged at her memory, familiar in a way she couldn't immediately place. She had seen that face somewhere recently, in passing, the way you see faces in magazines and on the sides of buses without really looking. Then it clicked. The boy in that photograph, aged forward 30-some years in Emily's mind, was Nathaniel Whitfield, the CEO whose company had just opened a new headquarters downtown. The man whose face had been on the cover of a business magazine Emily had glanced at while restocking napkins the week before. Emily said nothing. She simply looked up at Margaret, and Margaret, watching Emily's face carefully, saw the exact moment recognition arrived. "You know who he is," Margaret said quietly. "I think I do," Emily said. "Is he your son?" Margaret nodded, tears finally slipping free. "He doesn't know where I am, and I don't know how to tell him what I've done." What do you think Margaret meant by that? What do you think she had done? Let us know your guess in the comments before we continue. While Emily and Margaret sat on that bench, Nathaniel Whitfield was 30 minutes away, stepping off a private plane after a week overseas closing a deal that had taken 8 months to negotiate. He was tired in the specific way successful people get tired, the kind of exhaustion that money cannot fix, and he was looking forward to nothing more than a quiet evening before a charity dinner his company was hosting the following night. His assistant, a sharp, efficient woman named Priya, met him at the car with a tablet full of messages that could wait and one that couldn't. "Nathaniel," she said, and something in her tone made him stop walking. "Your mother's caretaker called this morning. Margaret left the house yesterday afternoon and hasn't come back. Nobody's heard from her in over 18 hours. Nathaniel Whitfield, a man who had negotiated with foreign governments and hostile boards without raising his voice, felt the ground shift beneath him. His mother lived alone by choice, in a modest house he'd offered a dozen times to upgrade, an offer she'd refused every single time, insisting she didn't need more than she had. She was 74. She had a heart condition she rarely mentioned, and she had been missing for nearly a full day while he was 30,000 feet in the air. "Cancel everything," he said. "Get the security team. Get the police involved if we need to. Find her." Back at the cafe, Margaret finally told Emily the truth, slowly in pieces, the way people tell the truths that cost them the most. Years ago, before Nathaniel became who he was now, Margaret had made a decision she regretted every day since. His father, a man named Robert, had been abusive in ways Margaret never spoke about publicly, and one winter night, when Nathaniel was 11, Margaret had taken her son and left, with nothing but a suitcase and the money in her purse. They lived in a shelter for 2 months, then a car, then slowly a series of small apartments as Margaret worked 2 and 3 jobs to keep them fed. She never told Nathaniel the full truth about why they left, only that his father wasn't safe to be around, and Nathaniel, even as a boy, had understood enough not to ask for details. As he grew older, he built a life, then a company, then an empire, always making sure his mother had everything she needed. And Margaret, in turn, carried a private shame she had never resolved, the belief that she had failed him in those early years, that she hadn't been enough, that the poverty and instability of his childhood was a wound she had caused rather than one she had survived. She had gone to Bellamy's that day because, years ago, in the depths of their hardest winter, A kind waitress at that very restaurant had once slipped Margaret and 11-year-old Nathaniel a free meal, quietly, without being asked, and told her to come back any time. Margaret had spent 30 years wanting to find that woman and thank her properly. She had gone back, hoping someone might remember, hoping to finally close a circle that had been open for 3 decades. She hadn't expected humiliation. She hadn't expected security. And she certainly hadn't expected another kind waitress to step directly into the same role 3 decades later in the same building. For anyone just joining us, this is the story of Emily Carter and Margaret Whitfield, a waitress who lost her job defending a stranger, and the mother of a billionaire CEO who had been quietly, painfully searching for closure from a chapter of her life she'd never fully healed from. If this story is moving you so far, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep telling stories like this one. By early afternoon, Nathaniel's security team had pulled footage from every camera within a half-mile of the last place Margaret's caretaker had seen her. They found footage of Margaret entering Bellamy's. They found footage of the confrontation at the host's stand, the security guard's hand on her arm, and a young waitress stepping between them. They also found something else, footage from a nearby business of 2 men in a black sedan trailing Margaret and Emily down the street. Nathaniel didn't recognize the men, but his head of security did. They were associates of a man named Grant Sorensen, a former business partner of Nathaniel's who had been pushed out of an early venture years ago after a fraud investigation, a man who had never forgiven Nathaniel for it, and who had, apparently, learned that Margaret carried old family documents related to a trust, and an early ownership stake that, in the wrong hands, could be twisted into a costly and public legal mess for Nathaniel's company. It wasn't about the necklace. It wasn't about money in her purse. Someone wanted the letter and the old paperwork tucked inside that handbag, hoping to manufacture a claim against a company worth billions. Nathaniel felt something cold settle into his chest. His mother wasn't just missing. She was being followed by people who knew exactly what she was carrying and exactly how to make her disappearance look like an accident if it came to that. Have you ever had someone from your past resurface, not to make amends, but to take something from you? Let us know how you handled it. While the search for Margaret intensified, Emily walked her back toward Margaret's neighborhood, unaware of just how much danger had been trailing them both throughout the afternoon. Margaret insisted on stopping by a small pharmacy for her heart medication, a stop that would prove important later, since it placed a timestamp and a witness on their location. Meanwhile, Emily's own world was quietly beginning to unravel in a different, more frightening direction. Her neighbor, an older woman named Doris who watched Sophie some afternoons, called Emily's cell phone in a panic. A car, she said, had pulled up near the school pickup line, and a man Doris didn't recognize had approached Sophie, asking if she was Emily Carter's daughter, before a teacher's aide intervened and the man walked away. Emily's hands went cold around the phone. She told Margaret what had happened, and for the first time, Margaret's face showed genuine terror, not for herself, but for the little girl she had never met. "They're not just watching me," Margaret said. "They're trying to find leverage. I am so sorry, Emily. I never meant to put your family in danger." Emily didn't have time to be angry. She had time only to move. She called the school, confirmed Sophie was safe and being kept inside under supervision, and then turned to Margaret with a steadiness that surprised even her. "We need to find your son. Now." Margaret, shaking, finally pulled a small folded card from an inner pocket of her handbag, a card Nathaniel had given her years ago with a direct number to his personal assistant, in case of emergencies she had never once used, because she had never wanted to be a burden. Emily dialed the number standing on a street corner, her own daughter's safety and a stranger's missing mother suddenly tangled into the same emergency. Priya answered on the second ring, and Emily explained quickly and clearly who she was with, and what had happened over the last several hours. Within 20 minutes, two black SUVs, very different from the one that had been following them, pulled up to the curb. Nathaniel Whitfield stepped out of the first vehicle before it had fully stopped. He crossed the sidewalk in long, urgent strides, and when his eyes found his mother standing beside a stranger in a waitress's uniform, something in his composed, powerful exterior simply broke open. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking in a way that no boardroom had ever heard. Margaret stepped forward and let her son hold her, right there on the sidewalk, in front of strangers, in front of Emily, in front of everything. After a long moment, Nathaniel finally turned to Emily, who stood a respectful distance away, unsure whether to stay or quietly disappear now that Margaret was safe. "This is Emily," Margaret said, still holding onto her son's arm. "She lost her job today because she wouldn't let a security guard put his hands on me. And then she spent the rest of the afternoon making sure I was safe, even after men started following us, even after I told her almost nothing about why." Nathaniel looked at Emily with an expression she couldn't quite read, gratitude and disbelief tangled together. "You didn't know who she was?" "No," Emily said honestly. "I didn't know, and it wouldn't have mattered if I did. She needed help, that's all I saw." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, processing not just the danger his mother had been in, but the small, ordinary decency that had kept her safe through the worst of it. A decency that had cost this young woman her job and very nearly put her own daughter at risk. "Where is your daughter now?" he asked. "At school under supervision. I need to get to her." "Then let's go," Nathaniel said, already turning toward the SUV. "All of us." Sophie Carter was 8 years old, with her mother's steady eyes and a habit of asking questions adults often couldn't answer. When Emily arrived at the school, flanked by 2 SUVs and a security detail that made the front office visibly nervous, Sophie ran straight into her mother's arms without asking a single question about who any of these people were. Nathaniel watched the reunion from a few feet away, and something in his chest, already raw from the day's events, tightened further. He thought of his own childhood, the shelters, the back seat of a car in winter, his mother's exhausted hands tucking a blanket around him even when she had nothing left to give. He thought about how close today had come to repeating some version of that same story for a different mother and a different daughter, except this time, because of a debt he hadn't even known his family owed. He crouched down to Sophie's level once Emily gave a small nod of permission. "Your mom did something very brave today," he said. "She protected someone who needed protecting, even when it cost her a lot. I just wanted you to know that." Sophie looked at him seriously, the way children do when they sense an adult is telling the truth. "She always says being kind doesn't cost anything." Nathaniel glanced up at Emily, something shifting visibly in his expression. "Today it cost her quite a bit," he said quietly. "I intend to fix that." If you were Nathaniel in that moment, watching your mother's rescuer stand there with her own child, not asking for anything in return, what would you have wanted to do for her? Tell us in the comments. The following morning, Nathaniel requested the full security footage from Billioniare's, along with copies of every customer video that had circulated online overnight. What had started as a handful of amused onlookers recording an old woman's humiliation had, by that morning, become a story spreading rapidly across social media, though none of the posters yet knew who the old woman actually was. Nathaniel didn't need public attention to get answers. He simply needed the truth, and the footage provided it clearly. Roger Daniels was seen humiliating Margaret loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. Kevin, the security guard, was seen grabbing her arm without provocation, and Emily was seen, unmistakably, stepping between them, calm and unwavering, before being stripped of her apron and walked out. When confronted by the restaurant's ownership group later that day, Daniels attempted to claim Margaret had been disruptive, that Emily had been insubordinate. The footage told a different story, And so did the diner owner's own conscience once he watched it in full, particularly the moment Margaret whispered that she only needed 5 minutes. Daniels was terminated by end of day. Kevin was terminated alongside him. The restaurant's ownership issued a public apology, not because Nathaniel demanded one, but because, once the full story became known, even they understood there was no version of that day's events they could defend. Emily, when asked by a reporter outside her apartment what she wanted to happen to the two men, gave an answer that surprised almost everyone who heard it. "I don't want revenge," Emily said, standing on her small apartment balcony with Sophie half hidden behind her leg. "I want them to understand what they did wrong. I want the next elderly person who walks into that restaurant or any restaurant to be treated like a person and not an inconvenience. That's it. That's all I want." The clip of her answer spread even faster than the original video, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet and genuine in a way the internet doesn't often reward. And yet, that day, it did. Nathaniel watched the clip from his office downtown, and he thought about his mother, about the 30 years she had carried guilt over a childhood she hadn't caused and couldn't have prevented, and about a young waitress who had just demonstrated, without trying to prove anything, exactly the kind of person his mother had always hoped he would grow up to become. He picked up his phone and asked Priya to clear his schedule for the following afternoon. There was somewhere he needed to go and something he needed to offer, and he wanted to do it in person, not through a lawyer, not through a check mailed anonymously, but standing in Emily Carter's home, looking her in the eye. The next afternoon, Nathaniel Whitfield arrived alone. No security detail, no assistant, just a man in a plain jacket standing outside a modest apartment building holding nothing but his own two hands. Sophie answered the door first, recognizing him immediately, and called back over her shoulder that the helicopter man was here, which made Nathaniel laugh for the first time in what felt like days. He stepped inside, and Emily watched him take in the apartment quietly. The small kitchen, the radiator in the corner, the water stain spreading across one corner of the ceiling where the roof had been leaking for months, the notice from Walter's care facility sitting, unopened, on the counter. "You lost your job," Nathaniel said finally, "because you protected my mother. You put your own family at risk because you wouldn't leave a stranger to be humiliated alone. I don't know how to properly thank someone for that, so I'm not going to pretend a single gesture could cover it. But I want to start somewhere." Emily opened her mouth to protest, the way people do when kindness feels too large to accept, but Nathaniel continued gently before she could. "This isn't charity, Emily. This is a debt. My mother is alive and safe today because of a choice you made in about 3 seconds, without knowing anything about who she was. That matters more than any amount of money I could offer, but I'd like to offer it anyway." Nathaniel laid it out simply, without spectacle. A stable, comfortable home for Emily and Sophie, in a good school district, with a working roof and no radiator that clanked through the night. A full college fund set up for Sophie, untouched by anything that might happen in the years between now and then. Medical coverage for Walter, moved to a facility with better memory care, closer to Emily so she could visit without spending half her evening on a bus. A steady salary, not as a favor, but as director of a new community outreach initiative his company was launching, one focused on dignity and support for elderly and low-income families across the city. "You don't have to decide today," he said, "but I wanted you to know it's real and it's not going anywhere, whether you say yes tomorrow or next month." Emily sat down slowly at her small kitchen table, her hands pressed against her face, and for the first time since walking out of Bellamy's 2 days earlier, she let herself cry, not from grief, but from the sudden, overwhelming release of a weight she had been carrying quietly for years. Margaret, who had been waiting outside to give them privacy, stepped in a moment later and wrapped her arms around Emily without a word. "You reminded me who I wanted to be," Margaret said softly. Thank you for giving me the chance to become her again. If you were Emily in that moment, would you have accepted right away, or would you have needed time to process an offer that large? Let us know honestly in the comments. 6 months later, Bellamy's reopened under new management, though it barely resembled its former self. What had once been an exclusive lunch spot for the city's wealthiest was now, every Saturday morning, transformed into a free community kitchen, serving warm meals to elderly residents across the neighborhood, many of whom arrived not out of necessity, but simply because they no longer wanted to eat alone. Emily Carter stood at the center of it most weekends, no longer in a waitress's apron, but in a simple community outreach badge that read Director, Whitfield Family Foundation. She still remembered small details about people, the way she always had, which coffee, which chair by the window, which stories they liked to tell twice. Sophie had grown an inch and gained a small, steady confidence that came from watching her mother turn hardship into something that helped other people. Walter, in his new facility, had a window that looked out over a garden, and though his memory continued to fade, he still lit up every single time Emily walked through the door. And Margaret Whitfield, no longer chasing ghosts from 30 years ago, spent her Saturday mornings at a corner table in the community kitchen, greeting every elderly guest personally, remembering, better than almost anyone, exactly what it felt like to walk into a room afraid nobody would see you. As the last Saturday crowd thinned out one autumn afternoon, almost exactly a year after that first, terrible day at Bellamy's, Margaret sat with Emily on the same kind of park bench where they had first spoken honestly with one another. The city moved around them, indifferent and busy, the way cities always do. "Do you ever think about how differently that day could have gone?" Emily asked. "If I just stayed at my table?" Margaret considered the question for a long moment. "I think about it every day," she said. "But I don't think you could have stayed at that table, Emily. Not really. That's not who you are." Emily smiled, watching Sophie chase a stray leaf across the grass nearby, watching an elderly man walk out of the community kitchen with a warm meal and a lighter step than he'd walked in with. Margaret reached over and took Emily's hand, the same steady, weathered hand that had once gripped a handbag full of a lifetime's worth of guilt. "Kindness always finds its way home," she said quietly. "It just sometimes takes the long way to get there." Before you go, we want to ask you directly. Have you ever helped a stranger without knowing what it might cost you, or what it might one day give back? Tell us your story in the comments below. And if this video moved you even a little, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still matters.